Today we're going to learn Eruvin Daf Pei Daled. Today's daf is dedicated by Debbie Ziering in loving memory of her mother, Evelyn Trotsky, Esther Chava Bat Avraham Zichronah Levarcha, on her 23rd yahrzeit, a woman of quiet strength, grace, and dignity, taken from us much too early. And we're going to also learn for Refuah Shlema for David ben Adel. We're now going to start our daf. We'll review a little bit from the Mishnah. Okay, if you got through yesterday's daf, today's daf should be a lot easier. We're going to just review quickly the Mishnah, and we're going to see that the Mishnah, this is a good example of we have a Mishnah, and we think we understand it in a particular way, and then the Gemara is going to change our perception. Some is going to be just, how would I say, they attempt to explain it somewhat differently. In the end, they won't, but other parts of it, they're actually going to explain very differently from the way they appear in our Mishnah, or the way the simple reading of the Mishnah, which always begs the question, is that really the way the Mishnah was meant? And just to the people in the time of the Gemara, they couldn't view the Mishnah that way, or maybe the Mishnah really did mean what the people in the Gemara think it meant. Right? So there's always a bit of a question in that kind of a case. It's always the danger when you learn the Mishnah. For example, if you learn Mishnah with Kahati generally will explain the Mishnah. I didn't check here, but he usually explains the Mishnah based on the way the Gemara understands it ultimately, which sometimes then it takes away your clear, kind of if you looked at just the Mishnah and you learned it differently, how you would understand it. That's why you have a book like Safrai's books on Mishnah, which I've quoted a number of times, Mishnah Eretz Yisrael, where he looks more at the Mishnah itself. And what do you think the Mishnah was talking about before we get to what the Gemara does with it? He'll also bring up what the Gemara says, but he'll also bring up other sources. Sometimes our Gemara might say one thing, the Yerushalmi might say something else. They're just touching on broader issues here. So now the Mishnah says, Anshe Chatzer v'Anshe Merpeset sheshachachu Amam Pei Gimel Amud Bet in the Mishnah. We have people living in a courtyard and people living in the Merpeset. Okay, now we assume it means they're living in the house, it leads out to the Merpeset. Soon we'll question that assumption. Is that really our case? Okay, I'll pull up the picture. Okay, what happens here? This is the picture from yesterday. Shachachu v'lo irvu. So now they didn't make an eruv. This is almost, imagine an apartment building. So we have people living in an apartment building on the higher floors and people living on the lower floors. Everybody on the second floor made an eruv with each other. Everyone on the first floor made an eruv with each other, but they didn't make an eruv between the two of them. So now, what do we say? If if you have an amud, a beam, or you have a bore or a cellar, we saw a rock, okay, a pit, something that's 10 tfachim high, it goes to the merpeset. We assume it belongs to Anshe merpeset because the people below don't really have access. Any less than that, it goes to the courtyard, which we assume means, and again, we're going to change this, but we assume that means if it's less than 10, so it belongs to the courtyard and they have access, not the merpeset. Then we say the same thing with a bore and a cellar. And then we say under one condition though, it has to be, as you see in the picture, that they're all very close to the merpeset. But if they're 4 tfachim away, then already we're going to say it goes to the people in the courtyard, okay? That it's no longer accessible to the people in the merpeset because it's farther away from the merpeset. Which seems very logical, but soon we're going to question that logic and think that maybe it says something a little bit different. So then the Gemara brought up all these cases of when it's noach for one person and not noach for the other, where it's easily accessible to one and not easily accessible to the other. And then it always goes to the person who is easily accessible to. And then the Gemara asked the following question. Again, I'm just reviewing, just to kind of get you back into the mode, what we're up to. Amar Rav Nachman, we're about 9 lines from the bottom of Pei Gimel Amud Bet. What if for one he has to lower and the other one has to throw it up, meaning it's 10 tfachim away from the upper people and 10 tfachim away from the bottom people, right? Until now, it was always easier for one, not for the other. This is, you would think, easily inaccessible because it's 10 and 10, and we're going to see, right? So now let's see what they say. Amar Rav, Shnei Masurim. Rav says what we would expect. It's equally inaccessible to both. But Shmuel has a different approach. He says, no t'nimoto lezeh shebeshulshul. He basically says, relatively speaking, it's more easily accessible to the one who lowers it rather than the one who has to throw onto it. Okay, something that's lower is more accessible than something that's higher, and therefore he's going to say that in this case we're going to give it to the Anshe merpeset. Okay, like in our so actually we didn't get to our case yet, but we're going to give it to the people who live higher up. Okay, that's what we're going to say. The structure of today's daf is very simple. we're going to bring two sources to support Shmuel. We're going to reject them. And then we're going to bring two sources to support Rav, and we're going to reject them. That's the simple of today's stuff. Before we move on, I want to show you finally, I should have done this earlier, how much 10 Tfachim is, okay? Maybe I didn't really want to show you this before because it's going to complicate the reality of everything that we're doing. But I have a tape measure here, okay? There's different opinions, like in all the measurements, and we saw that yesterday, because also the measurements got bigger over time, and there's always a debate about what exactly they are, how much how much does everything translate into our measurements. But tefach can be a range of 7.6 centimeters, 8 centimeters, or 9.6 centimeters. Okay, so that's going to mean, let's just go with the average. 8 centimeters by 10 tefachim is 80 centimeters. Okay, 10 tefachim, which is also about 31 inches. Okay, for those who are thinking in inches. Okay, I'm going to show you the height of 80 centimeters. It's going to be hard because it won't even show up on my camera here. Okay, 80 centimeters. Let me move it down for a second. 80 centimeters gets you to here. Okay, this part of my body. Okay, obviously you don't all know how tall I am, but you could get a sense. 96 gets me up to here. Okay, almost to my waist. Okay, I'm not the tallest person, but you can get a sense of what that is. Now that's pretty low. Okay, that's going to make the reality of everything we've been learning about Yud Tfachim not being accessible kind of hard to understand, right? So either people were short, okay, or right, it's just a little bit hard to understand exactly how this works. Okay, so the whole issue of 10 Tfachim being inaccessible is hard to understand, but I'm going to leave it there. But now you at least know how tall, how high that is. So now, oh, I see people were saying they couldn't see. So let me do it again because I was in the small screen. Okay, I'll show you again the height. So 80 is here. Okay, 1 second, here. Okay, that's like the top of my leg. Okay, 96 is here. Okay, that's 96. Okay, so there you have our height. Okay, now we're going to go back and understand how we're going to understand our Mishnah to be a support for Shmuel, because we thought our Mishnah meant that it's 10 high, the Anshe Merpeset are at 10, the Chatzir is below 10, at the bottom. That makes sense. It's very accessible to the Anshe Merpeset. But now the Gemara is going to say, Tanan, okay, we're starting 4 lines from the bottom now, Pei Gimel Amud Bet. Anshe Chatzir v'Anshe Merpeset, sheshachachu v'lo irvu. So we're now going to bring our Mishnah to prove Shmuel. Okay, how so? So we're going to say, Kasal kadatach. So now we assume, now we didn't assume this, but the Gemara assumes when they bring this as a support for Shmuel, my merpeset b'nei aliyah. The merpeset isn't actually what we thought the merpeset was. The merpeset is b'nei aliyah. It's people living in the second floor. Now, think about it. Again, as I explained already, it's very low, the height of this 10 tefachim. Unlikely that the second floor is 10 tefachim above the first floor. And maybe that's why they assumed we must be talking about a merpeset, and I'll pull up the picture, that's exactly in between. There's a merpeset that's in between the aliyah, which let's assume the aliyah is 20 tefachim off the ground floor, and the courtyard. So they're in the middle, there's a merpeset, which means that, and now who is it accessible to? We're not talking about people living on the floor of the merpeset. We're talking about people living in the second floor above the merpeset, which is 10 tefachim above that. So we basically have height of the courtyard, 10, height of the merpeset, the porch. A merpeset is a porch, for those who don't know. Porch is at 10, the height of 10. Sorry, did I say the chatzir is at the ground level? Height of the merpeset is 10. Height of the aliyah is 20. Now it's perfect proof for Shmuel because it's lizeh b'shul shul. For the b'nei aliyah, they have to go down 10 to get to there. And lizeh b'zrika, for the people on the ground, they have to go up 10. And there we have a perfect explanation. And what do you see here? We say it goes to the anshe merpeset, which really means, according to them, the b'nei aliyah. So if it goes to the b'nei aliyah, what do you see? You see that it's even though they still have to go down 10, okay? So now you have to resolve a few things here. If it's really talking about B'nai Aliyah, so why didn't it say B'nai Aliyah? And that's what the Gemara asks. Umay karula merpeset. Why did they call the B'nai Aliyah, the people living in the second floor, the B'nai merpeset in the Mishnah? Because how do they get out? Okay, here, let's pull up the picture for one more second. The picture shows, the picture shows what? There's a staircase on the side here. How do the Anshe Aliyah get out of their space? They go down to the Merpeset through a staircase. You see here, this isn't exactly drawn to scale if we really think it's 20 tefachim, right? This is much longer than, the staircase is much longer than the height of 10 tefachim. But in any case, the idea is they get down through the Merpeset, and that's why they're called the B'nai Merpeset. Okay, so therefore, what do you learn from here? Proves Shmuel, Alma, Kol Lezeh B'Shulshulu Lezeh B'Zrika, right? This is a case where for the B'nai Aliyah, it's 10 down, and for the B'nai Chatzer, it's 10 up. And what do you see? Who gets it? The Merpeset. That proves, Shmuel, that it's easier, it's more accessible to those who have to lower down to get it than for those who have to throw things up to get there. So now they answer, no, not necessarily. You understood the Mishnah wrong. Keda'ama Rav Huna, as Rav Huna says elsewhere, which we're going to see in 2 minutes from now, Lo tamadarim b'merpeset. Just like Rav Huna said there, Lo tamadarim b'merpeset, it's for those living actually on the floor of the merpeset. Okay, whether they're living in the porch itself or they're living, if you saw in the picture, there's a door there that led out to the merpeset. Maybe their door just leads right out to the merpeset. They are on this in-between level, which by the way, in lots of houses, they have half levels, right? You go up and there's an area there, and then you go up more and there's an area there. So you could understand the reality where maybe the height would be 10 tefachim because they're on like a half floor. Okay, so it's those living in the merpeset, like he says elsewhere, which we're going to see is elsewhere in our Mishnah. Hachanami lo tamadarim b'merpeset. Likewise, you could say the same thing here, in which case it doesn't prove Shmuel at all, because again, then it goes back to the way we understood it to begin with, which means it's very accessible to the merpeset people. It's just not accessible to the chatzer people. And then it's that imbalance, and then it would clearly go, even according to Rav, to the merpeset. And then it doesn't teach us anything about lezeh b'shulshul u lezeh b'zrika. So then the Gemara questions this though. Ihachi ema seifa. But then the continuation doesn't make any sense. It says after this, pachot mikan lechatzer. Any less than 10, it goes to the people living in the courtyard. Amai. Why would that be? If it's any less than 10, think about it. Amai. Lezeh b'petachu lezeh b'petachu. I said it very simply as if it's obvious, but it's not really obvious. Think about it. If you have an amud in Rishut HaRabim, in the Chatzer, in the courtyard, that's less than 10, okay? But it's still an amud. That means it's above the ground and it's close to the merpeset. Let's say it's 5. Let's just give it an average height, okay? It's 5. If it's 5, what's going to be? Well, it's lizrika of 5 from the Anshe Chatzer, and it's shulshul of 5, right? Lowering down of 5 from the Anshe Merpeset. It's actually equidistant between both. And even if you say 8 and 2, let's say the height is 2, and it's closer to the Anshe Chatzer, anything that's within 10, we assume is accessible. So it's basically, no matter what, it's going to be accessible to both. So why does it say in the Mishnah, lezeh b'petachu, lezeh b'petachu? It does, the opposite. Why does it say, pachot mikan lechatzer? Because really it's a case of lezeh b'petach or lezeh b'petach. To both, it's equally accessible. Again, equal doesn't have to be equal, but it has to be basically anything less than 10 is accessible. So therefore, they now reinterpret the Mishnah. I warned you of this when I read it. My lechatzer, af lechatzer. When it says, we thought it meant, right? If it's height of 10, it goes to the merpeset, that for sure, right? And then we just questioned, is it the b'nai aliyah or the b'nai merpeset? So right now, we said it's the b'nai merpeset. So now the Gemara wants to suggest, no, it must be the B'nai Aliyah, because if it's not the B'nai Aliyah, then what would we say? If it's not the B'nai Aliyah, we're going to say it's the Anshe Merpeset, and the Anshe Merpeset have just as equal access as the Chatzer. So the Gemara is going to try to say, maybe we're back to thinking like we thought a minute ago, that it was Anshe Aliyah, and they're more than 10 away, right? If, again, let's assume height of 20 is the Aliyah. This amud is now, let's say, height of 5. It's 15 away, and that's why the B'nai Chatzer get it. But now they say, no. When it says la Chatzer, it doesn't mean what we thought it meant, that it's except that who gets rights to it, the B'nai Chatzer? No. It means ah la Chatzer u'shnehem asurim. It's a radical interpretation. It's really not what it says there. Right? The Mishnah said very clearly, either it goes to the merpeset or it goes to the Chatzer. Now we're going to say either it goes to the merpeset if it's a height of 10, or we're going to say it's even accessible to the courtyard at any lower height, and also accessible to the merpeset, in which case it turns into a case of they both have equal access, which means it's going to be forbidden to both. Okay, it certainly didn't say that in the Mishnah, but that's how they're going to read the Mishnah. They read the Mishnah against the Pshat, really, and they say lechatzer means it's also accessible to the chatzer and to the merpeset, in which case no one's going to have access. And again, it doesn't prove anything about Shmuel, because again, we're back to saying it's talking about a merpeset actually, and not the Bnei Aliyah, which means it's not a case where it's every source we're going to try to say this is a case of lezebish shul u lezebish rika, and look at the halacha, it matches either Shmuel or Rav. And in every case, we're going to say, no, it's not a case of lezebish shul and lezebish rika, and we're going to prove why not. So hachinami mistabra, and we're going to further prove, how do you know that lachatzer means af lachatzer, and they're actually both forbidden, and not what we thought originally, that it's allowed to the anshe chatzer and not to the anshe merpeset? Midikatani seifa, because look at that last line. The last line also we're going to now reinterpret. Bamed dvarim amurim besmucha, aval b'mufleget afilu gavo 10 tvachim lachatzer. Now again, this case is kind of troublesome. When I said it very simply, as if it's obvious. Oh, once it's moved away from the merpeset, it's not really accessible to the merpeset. But the Gemara is going to say, what do you mean? If it's at a height of 10, think about it. Even if it's far away from the merpeset, it's still not very accessible to the anshe chatzer. They still have to throw it up 10, right, to get to the height of 10. And the merpeset have to throw it kind of, this way to get, if they have to throw it, across the courtyard, the people in the chatzer have to throw it upwards. It's basically equally inaccessible to both. So it doesn't make any sense that the anshe chatzer should get it just because it's, even imagine, let's just take a case where it's 5 tvachim away. So you're basically within 5 tvachim from the merpeset is this amud at your height level. And from the ground, it's 10 tvachim high. It actually seems to be less accessible to the anshe chatzer. So why does it say lachatzer? So again, what do they interpret? My lachatzer. If you're going to say it belongs to the chatzer and they can carry items onto that beam, amai rishuta de travayu. Really, it's equally accessible to both. Therefore, elamai lachatzer, af lachatzer u'shnehem asurim. So since that part of the Mishnah has to read lachatzer means even accessible to the chatzer, or basically just as equally inaccessible to the courtyard as it is to the merpeset, and therefore no one's allowed to carry on there. Like this goes back to the case, let's say, of the wall. Remember the wall that's 10 high? Neither one can put items onto it. Remember, if there was a fruit bowl on top, they could each eat the fruits at the top, but no one's allowed to bring fruits onto there. So therefore, we're going to say the same thing here. So this means af lachatzer, even to the courtyard, and it's basically equally inaccessible to both, and therefore no one's allowed to carry on there. Okay, so therefore they're going to say hachanami. Likewise, you could say that on the earlier section, my lechatzer af lechatzer shnehem asurim shmami now, which again shows that we're talking about the bnei merpeset and not the bnei aliyah, in which case it's not a case of lezebish shul u lezebish rika. Now we're going to move on to case number 2. I promised you 2 cases to prove Shmuel and 2 to prove Rav. Tanan, our Mishnah also, chuliyat habor vasela. This is basically going to be a repeat. And even though we just concluded a minute ago that merpeset means merpeset and not aliyah, we're going to take this case as if we're starting from scratch and assuming in the beginning that it means aliyah. So shmamin ad chuliyat habor vasela shem gvohim asara la merpeset. If you have a hole, right, the opening of a ditch or a well, or you have a rock that's 10 high, right, that's at a height of 10. La merpeset, it goes to the people in the merpeset. Pachot mikan lachatzer. Any less, it goes to the chatzer. And again, they assume, it doesn't even say this inside, but you take it for granted that what they're talking about is that these are at a height from the aliyah. Okay, that there must be an aliyah here, and it's lezebish shul from the aliyah. He's 10 away from, he has to go down 10, and from the chatzer they have to go up 10, and yet it goes to the bnei aliyah because it's easier. This is Shmuel, right? It's easier to lower things than it is to get things from lower than it is from high, to go high. But Amar Rav Huna, and this is where Rav Huna actually said it, that we quoted it 2 minutes ago. Amar Rav Huna, or 5 minutes ago, lo tama darim b'merpeset. Rav Huna says, oh no, we're not talking about people living in the aliyah. We're talking about people living in the merpeset on that level. So now they're going to question this again. Tina sela bor ma'ika lememar. I understand when you're talking about the rock, but what about a bore? Okay, so now we're going to pull up the other pictures. Let's see if, no, I'm still on the wrong one. 1 second. Quick second. I need to pull up the other pictures. Okay. So now, moving between pictures of today and pictures of yesterday's stuff. So now pulling up pictures. Now this is, okay. So now we're going to pull up the pictures for today. We have a lot of pictures, as you can see. Okay. So the first picture is 279. Now think about a rock. If there's a rock, there's no picture of the rock here, but if there's a rock, it's just like the amud, the beam. So it's basically accessible to the B'nai Merpeset. It's on their, at their height. And for the B'nai Chatzer, it's inaccessible because it's 10 high. But bor ma'ika l'meimar. How do you get into a bor? What do? A bor generally you use to draw water. So if you can see from the picture here, you take the you take a rope and you lower down, right? You tie a pail onto it. You lower it down into the bore. And the bore we're generally, right? It's at least 10 tefachim deep. Okay, it could be even deeper. It could be under the ground. But what's going to happen? You're basically lowering it down 10 tefachim to the bottom of the pit. Let's assume the pit is at a height of 10. So again, this would be a case, lizebish shulshul, right? The upper people have to lower down 10 tefachim. And the lower people, the Chatzer people, have to raise, right? It's actually, I don't know the reality of this either, but they have to throw their pail. You can see it in the picture, right? You have the pail attached to a rope. They throw it over 10 tefachim, and then they have to draw it out, right? The tricky part, obviously, is drawing it out without all the water spilling. But let's just assume they can do that. So again, it's a case of tashmisho b'shulshul and zet tashmisho b'zrika. You could see, by the way, why b'zrika would be a little more complicated than b'shulshul, especially in this case. So here you have a case where that's what it is, and that would prove Shmuel. So Amar Rav Yitzchak, Bered Rav Yehuda, Hacha bebor mele'am mayim askinan. Okay, let's move to picture number 280. If the bore is full of water, then when you're getting it from the merpeset, you're actually not going down 10 tefachim deep into the bottom of the pit. You're going into the top part, which is very accessible to you because the height of the water is at the top. And even if it's, let's say, 2 tefachim down, 3 tefachim, 4 tefachim, doesn't matter. It's still much more accessible than the 10, right? Anything under 10 is fine. So they say, that must be the case. In which case, again, we're going to say, this doesn't have anything to do with Shmuel, Lezeb Shulshulu, Lezeb Rika, because it's within 10 of the upper people. But they say, what do you mean? V'ha chasra. But over the course of Shabbat, what will happen? All the people in the merpeset will take water. In the end, it's going to be lower than 10. It's going to go all the way down. So the water level will drop. So what does the Gemara answer? Kevan dechimal yashari ki chasra nami sharia. This is what we've said before. Once you allow it for the beginning of Shabbat, we can allow it for the rest of Shabbat, even if over the course of time, it will become inaccessible. Since it was accessible at the beginning of Shabbat because it was full of water, even if it empties out and you have to basically put your pail in more than 10 tefachim, still we're going to say since it was allowed at the beginning, it's allowed now. But the Gemara doesn't like that, in which case, right? So then we're going to say, Adrabah, what do you mean? Kevan dechi chasra asira. Kimal yanami asira. Since once it's empty, it's going to be forbidden to you, then we should forbid it also when it's full. In other words, they're going to say no. If you want to say that once it gets lower, it's going to be inaccessible, because again, this is rough. Okay, lezeb shulshulu, lezeb rika is going to be forbidden to both. So if this case turns into a case of both are equally inaccessible to both, then we're going to forbid it. Well, then we shouldn't permit it when there's water, because this is classic, right? If people will draw it out when it's allowed, then they'll think they could draw it out when it's not allowed. And we don't want that to happen, right? If level drops down to below 10, let's assume there's more water and it's deeper than 10. So we shouldn't allow it. So therefore they answer, El Amar Abaye, and we're trying to find a case where it's full. Okay. And then once we say it's full, we can say this isn't Shmuel. As long as we can explain this, we want to use this to prove that Shmuel's right. But if we can basically, and then the Gemara's agenda after that is to say, no, you can't necessarily prove that Shmuel's right, because this case could be some other case. Okay. It could be a case that's not discussing Shmuel. So all we're trying to do is to find a potential way that this case could be discussing something that isn't according to Shmuel. That's our agenda. So they say, you could say, fine, water. We know everybody's going to draw water on Shabbat. There won't be any water left, or it'll go down level, at least go down 10 tefachim and become inaccessible. And that's why this wouldn't be allowed. But what about fruits? Let's say it's full of fruits. Their assumption right now is if it's full of fruits, we're not going to empty the whole thing, 10 tefachim's worth on Shabbat. But the Gemara says, what do you mean? Ha chasre. You could theoretically, people eat a lot on Shabbat. They could actually empty it, and it could be the exact same problem. So their basic point is there's no way they're going to allow the B'nai Merpesa to access this pit full of fruits or full of water when, if over the course of Shabbat, it might go under 10. And if it gets under 10, it's going to be inaccessible. And then it'll be B'reshut Shnehem, and it'll be forbidden. They're not going to allow it when it's full either. So they answer B'tiva. It must be talking about fruits that are tevel. What is fruits that are tevel? Fruits that are tevel are fruits that you haven't taken trumot masrot. Why does that make a difference? Because they're muktzah. You're not allowed to fix them on Shabbat. We learned that. It's like metake mana. You're fixing something. You're not allowed to take trumot masrot on Shabbat. Therefore, these fruits are muktzah, which means you're not going to move the fruits. So you might say, if you're not going to move the fruits, then what are you using the pit for? Right? The ditch is useless. And then, until now, we've been talking about you're using it to take water out or to take fruits out. So I assume what they mean is you're using it, let's say, to put something on top, right? If it's empty, putting something on top basically means putting it down 10 tefachim deep. But if it's full, you could put something on top there. If it's full of fruits, maybe you want to put something else in there. Maybe you have some other fruits you want to stick in, or I don't know what you want. Right? Probably wouldn't be so smart. Then you'll end up with a mix of, something you already took trumot masrot and something you didn't, but let's say it was a different kind of fruit or anything you might want to put there that wouldn't destroy the fruits, I guess. You could technically use it. So therefore, they say, in the end, they conclude it must be a bor meleah perot, and they're perot of tevel. Okay, they're muktzah, which means it's not going to get any lower over the course of Shabbat, and that's why it's accessible to the B'nai Merpesa, not accessible to the people on the ground in the courtyard, which is why it says that the B'nai Merpesa can access it, and this has nothing to do with Shmuel, because it's not the case that Rav and Shmuel were arguing about, and therefore it doesn't prove Shmuel. And now they're going to say, Daikanami Dikatane. I can further prove this from the language of the Braita, of the Mishnah, Jumia de Sela. Remember, we've seen this many times when there's two words that appear right next to each other, two cases that are put together. We assume that what's true about one is true about the other, that each one has characteristics of the other. So, Jumia de Sela Shmamina. Now, what's a Sela? A Sela is a rock. It's full, it's whole, right? There's no empty space in it. So it must be a bor that's full like a Sela. Okay. So now they say, well, if it's just like a sela, then you wouldn't need to say both, right? So, lama limit a bor, lama limit a sela. Now, in this case, they don't explain why they're going to explain why you need a bor in addition to sela. Now, sela, they don't even explain why you need it, but obviously you need it to show that the bor is like a sela. If you just have bor, you would have thought maybe an empty bor. Sela is there to teach you the bor is like the sela, but why did you need to tell us bor? Sricha, if you just had sela, there's no reason to make any gzera, forbid it for any reason. Aval bor, ligzor, now we're assuming bor full of peirot that no trumot masrot were taken from. Again, this is taking a source that certainly didn't say anything about fruits and certainly didn't say about fruits that were tevel, but in order to understand it and in order to say maybe it's not proving Shmuel, they can suggest that maybe the case is a bor meleah perot of tevel. Now, bor meleah perot of tevel, you might have thought there's a reason to forbid it. Why? Because bor ligzor zimnin demalya perot metukanim. Sricha. You might have thought we're going to forbid it when it's full of your perot that are tevel, that you didn't take trumot masrot from, because maybe you'll think then that it's okay in a bor that's full of regular fruits that might be removed on Shabbat. And that we already said is forbidden because maybe you'll empty them and then it'll be equally inaccessible to both. So therefore, you might have thought that's why the Mishnah teaches you that case, so that you know bor and sela and even a bor that's full of muktzah items. Okay, it could be any muktzah items, by the way. Again, I see the questions in the chat. What I said is it's true the fruits are muktzah, but there's no forbidden, it's not forbidden to touch muktzah. People always think you can't touch something that's muktzah. It's forbidden to move them. What I'm talking about is using the space on top of the fruits. So that's not muktzah. You're allowed to put something on top of something muktzah. That's not a problem. Okay, so that's the idea. Okay, now we're moving on to our proofs for Rav. Tashma, Anshe Chatzer v'Anshe Aliyah, Sheshachachu v'lo irvu. Again, we have people living upstairs and people living downstairs, right? So again, apartment building, people on the second floor all did an eruv with each other. People on the bottom floor didn't make an eruv with each other. People on the second floor all made an eruv with each other and people on the first floor all made an eruv with each other, but people on the first and the second floor did not make an eruv altogether. So They forgot. Okay, it doesn't really matter whether they forgot or not, but they didn't make an eruv. אנשי חצר משתמשים ב10 התחתונים, ואנשי עלייה משתמשים ב10 העליונים. So each one gets, right, the bottom 10 go to the אנשי חצר, the top 10 go to the אנשי עלייה. So what is this talking about? Ketzat. So the Gemara, the Braita says, what's the case? And we'll look at the next picture, picture 281. Ketzat, ziz יוצא מן הכותל, למטה מ10 לחצר, למעלה מ10 לעלייה. So if you have something jutting out, remember like a shelf jutting out of the wall, assuming your aliyah is about 20, and we have one that's below 10 and one that's above 10. So the shelf that's above 10 belongs to the Anshe aliyah. The upper floor can use, floor number 2 can use that shelf because it's only really accessible to them. And the one at 5 is for the Bnei Chatzer because it's accessible to them. This is very obvious. But what do they infer from this source? Again, they're going to make an inference, and then we're going to say you don't necessarily have to make the inference, and then it doesn't prove Rav. But they're going to make an inference, it's going to prove Rav. Ha de bene bene, what if it were exactly a 10, which is Lizeb Shul, remember the top one, he can lower things onto it, and Lizeb Rika, from the Chatzar, he can raise things, throw things onto it. Since it doesn't mention that case, and it says if it's above 10, it's for the top. If it's below 10, it's for the bottom people. But the middle isn't mentioned. We assume the middle isn't mentioned because exactly at the middle will be forbidden because they both have equal access, right? It's equally inaccessible. Again, when I say equal, I don't exactly mean 50-50. It could be 60-40, right? That's why Shmuel thinks 60-40, it goes to the 60, right? Or 60 accessible, right? If it's more accessible than inaccessible, it's going to go to you. But Rav says, no, we're going to view this as if it's equally inaccessible. So Amar Rav Nachman, no, you can't necessarily infer that because you could assume Bikotel Tisha Asar Skinan. Maybe it's talking about a wall that's 19 high. If it's 19 high, there is no middle case of where it's going to be exactly a 10, right? Your middle point is going to be not at right? It will be at 9.5, which will be closer to the bottom, right? They'll be. Then we're going to say, as long as it's within 10 of the ground, Lizeb Petach or Lizeb Shulshul. So again, we're going to say it all depends, right? Basically, they're saying you can't infer anything from this source. This doesn't teach us about our case. Just like we said with the Shmuel cases, this isn't a case of Lizeb B'Shulshul or Lizeb B'Zrika because we're basically going to simply say that we don't know. They were just trying to infer something from that source. But who says that's an inference? Who says the case was 20? It never said that. It just said below 10, above 10. So it goes below 10, above 10, no matter what the height is. So now they're going to try their final source. Tashma, shtei gezuz traot zo lamala mizo. Okay, the final source on this page. Let's say you have 2 gezuz traot zo lamala mizo. Okay, so now let's see what that is. Gezuz traot are kind of like the Z's. It's a shelf that juts out. If you remember, we learned this a while ago, a few times, that if you live, let's say in Venice, okay, so it's the easiest example, where right outside your window is water. So what do you want to do? You want to access the water on Shabbat. But the water is a Carmelite, and you're living in a Rishud Yachid, and you can't carry from Rishud Yachid from a Carmelite to a Rishud Yachid. But if you make a hole, okay, I'm looking at the right-hand side of picture 282. If you make a hole in your gezustra, you can't exactly see the hole, but you can see they put a string through it, and you build mechitzot. Okay, there's a debate. Do you really need the mechitzot to be 10 tefachim long? But let's just assume right now they need to be 10 tefachim long, 4 by 4 wide. You build these mechitzot coming out of your gezustra, your little piece of balcony that comes out of your window. And what do we say? Even though those mechitzot don't go all the way down to the water, we view them as if we can have these imaginary mechitzot going down, which we allowed only for water purposes, right? Because remember, water was a necessity, and because of that, they allowed it only for water. You can now put your pail through these mechitzot and get it into the water and draw the water back up through this gezustra. Okay, now that's the basics, the basis of this whole thing. That's what you have to understand before we read it. Let's say you have 2 gezustraot, zo lamala mizo. One is at a higher height than the other, and the assumption is in this picture, you see, Rashi says they're not next to each other. I'm sorry, they're not one on top of the other, they're next to each other. Okay, so the one to the side is lower and to the side. So we have one lamala mizo. Asula elyona velo asula tachtona. Asu means they made mechitzot. So the upper one is allowed to draw water, and the bottom one, the lower one, is not because they didn't make a hole. But we're now going to say there's a separate issue. Even though the upper one is allowed to theoretically draw water, this is a solution that works, right? Because we can view these imaginary mechitzot as if they go down. What's the problem? The lower one has access to the hole in the upper one. He can throw his pail with the string, throw it over. Again, it's a little complicated how he's going to get it out and back onto his thing, but let's assume he can raise it back up while the deli is still upright and get it over to his mirpeset. So if he can do that, then basically because he can do that, therefore we're going to say let's say I'm the one who has the gazustra coming out with the hole that I can get water, but you have one right next to me. So at that point, if I do it, my porch or whatever we call this my balcony is equally accessible. Well, it's not equally, but it's accessible to me and you, and therefore you forbid it to me. Even though, right, this is classic Shmuel, even though according to Shmuel, and it's not Shmuel, it's the opposite of Shmuel, but it's what Shmuel was saying, even though for me it's much more accessible than it is for you, so Shmuel would say, you don't forbid me, I could do this. So what do you see here? This holds like Rav, because and you can even see here, and some of the Mepharshim talk about this, Rashi says, it's even the other person is Zrika and Shilshul, and I have just Shilshul, right? I just have to put my pail down. You have to throw it and put it down. So therefore, it's much more easily accessible to me, and yet it says it's forbidden to me to use because you also have access. So we're going to have two different answers, okay, and two different pictures for this. What the case is to basically say this doesn't prove Rav. It's not a case where it's less accessible to you, or again, it's a bit of a percentage game. How inaccessible is it to you? So we're going to say, it's not that they had to throw it, it's that they can walk right over. How can they walk right over if we have balconies at different heights? Oh, look at the picture 283. There's a ladder between us. Basically, there's a ladder that leads from yours to mine. Therefore, you can very easily come onto mine and take water. And that's why, because it's basically a free-for-all. It's just as equally accessible to you as it is to me. Again, maybe a little bit less, but not much more. Abai Amal, he says a different reason why he says it's not that there's a ladder, but kigon dekaimim b'toch hasara hadade. They're within less than 10 height difference between the two. Now remember, every time we talk about zrika, it's only if it's zrika more than 10. In this case, it's zrika less than 10 because the height difference is less than 10. And then he says, v'lo mabaya kamar, and the structure of this source is a lo mabaya structure, which means they didn't even need to tell you the reverse case, okay? It's obvious. Lo mabaya, what would be the reverse case? Asul l'tachtona v'lo asul l'elyona. What if the lower one had access and not the upper one? He's the one who made the mechitzot. De asire, there for sure they'd be asur. De kevan de bego asar de hadade kaimin asra hadade. Because from the upper one, I can easily get to the lower one. That for sure would be forbidden to both, because as me living in the upper, I can easily get to the lower. Ela afilu asula elyona v'lo asula tachtona. But even our case, in other words, the bright is saying, not only this case, if the lower one did, but even when the upper one does it, and you might have thought, again, right, let's play percentage games. In this case, it's a little bit less accessible for the lower one because he has to get up to mine. He still has to throw it. It's just that he has to throw it less than 10. You might have thought we're going to give it to the upper one, and we'll basically say the lower one, it's really not accessible enough for him. It comes to teach you, since they're within 10 of each other, they forbid each other, okay? That's what Abaye says. So again, we have two different answers. Either there's a ladder, and that's why it's accessible, or they're less than 10 distance, and anything less than 10, we're not going to call that inaccessible, okay? And that's why it's accessible. Even though it's a little less accessible, it's still accessible. Ki hada, now how do we know this? Ki hada amar Rav Nachman amar Shmuel. Okay, there's a bunch of debates about what exactly this case is. I'll show you this picture. The picture obviously only shows one approach, but assuming you have a roof, okay, now your roof, you have to understand this big question here, but I'll start with what's clear from the source here, and then we'll talk about what the questions are. But if you have a gag that's samuch l'reshut harabim, your roof is right next to the public domain. Okay, you see it here, and there's a merpeset jutting out. In the Shansin, they have a bit of a different picture, but somehow your roof is, there's a space, at least somewhere, where your roof access is Reshut Arabim. Okay, and in the picture in the Shansin, they have the merpeset going out the whole length of the roof, but on the side of the roof is the public domain. Here, the side of the roof is like someone's property, but the side of it, in other words, somewhere else, there's an access point from the roof. And the main point is there's some access point from the public to the Gag. Tzarich sulam kavua la'atiro. If I don't have a sulam kavua means a permanent ladder from this roof into my second floor, okay, because obviously the roof is very low. It's only 10 tefachim off the ground, or maybe we're going to say it's less than 10 tefachim. If I don't have a sulam kavua, then we're going to assume that I don't really use my roof so much. If I don't use my roof and my roof is accessible to Reshut Arabim, then we're going to assume that B'nai Reshut Arabim can use my roof, which means that no one's allowed to use it on Shabbat because you have access and right, anyone in the public domain has access and I have access. Now people say, what do you mean it's my roof? How can people in the public have access to my roof? But you have to understand that maybe the roofs in their day were not the way our roofs are. It wasn't really, because people barely use them, they were accessible to other people. And we saw that with Rabbi Shimon's opinion. Remember, you could carry from courtyard to courtyard or from roof to roof because the roofs weren't really considered part of the houses. Unless you have a sulam kavua, if you have a ladder that shows I use this to get to my house, then it's going to be the case. Okay, so now they're going to assume, okay, so now they say, sulam kavua in, sulam arai lo. It seems like if you have a temporary ladder, it's not going to, right? People, basically, it's going to be forbidden to me. Now, why? My timer. Now, if this roof is 10 tefachim off the Reshut Arabim, there's no way you don't have access to this. We always say 10 tefachim off the ground, there's no access. So everyone from the public, it's not accessible to them. So it must be, not like it shows in this picture, it must be, it's less than 10 off the ground. Because if it were more than 10 off the ground, you wouldn't have access. And again, we're assuming you have access. All the people in the public domain have access to this, and that's why it's forbidden to me. Okay, so it must be it's less than 10. And what do you see here? Anything less than 10, right, is considered all accessible. And that's what we were trying to show. But now they say, no, matkef l'Rav Papa. No, why did we say 10 is, remember our discussion about Reshut Arabim, and we talked about the people who have these bundles on their shoulders, they're carrying something heavy in Reshut Arabim, and they'll put it down on something, and that's what we're going to call a makom p'tur, an exempt space, because the Reshut Arabim have access to it. What is that? Anything less than 10 off the ground, right? We're going to assume at a height of 9, we generally say people will put their heavy bags on, but they're not going to do it at a height of 10. So that's what we assumed. This must be talking about a height of 9, right? Or less than 10. But Rav Papa says, and this is very interesting in light of what we learned, we never learned this before. Look at the picture here. There's someone carrying a heavy bag. He's not going to be able to lift his heavy bag 10 tefachim off the ground and put it at that height. It's very uncomfortable. But if he has a hat or something very light, like a kerchief, that it's not so hard to put that at 10 tefachim height, especially you saw what height it is. It's not very high. That already he can put at that kind of height. So that's why we're going to assume, since people can put their hats and other things, since at the exact height of 10, it's true it's generally inaccessible, but it's accessible for light items. And people might use my roof to put their hats down or their handkerchiefs or something light like that. Therefore, we're going to assume that's why this is accessible to the Reshut Arabim. And it doesn't teach you anything about less than 10 tefachim because it is 10 tefachim. And therefore, it doesn't prove our reading that we tried to read, that this doesn't prove Rav, that if they're within 10 tefachim, we were trying to prove Abaye that if they're within 10 tefachim, but it doesn't prove it, but still we've shown that the source doesn't necessarily agree with Rav anyway. It's just that we don't have a good proof for Abaye from this source. Okay, we're going to end here for today. Like I said, the structure was very simple. Question against Shmuel, question against Shmuel, question against Rav, question against Rav. Each case, we basically came up with some explanation as to why it wasn't necessarily that you had to read the source that way, but you could read it some other way, which then wasn't really relating to our case. Okay, with that, have a good day. Shavua Tov, everybody.